They say the ocean keeps her secrets in the deepest trenches, in the places where light surrenders and pressure becomes a physical presence that reshapes everything it touches. I learned that the ocean keeps her lovers there too, in those impossible depths where human bodies cannot survive, but human souls can linger, transformed by salt and longing into something that belongs neither to the surface world nor to the abyss, but exists in the liminal space between drowning and transcendence. My name is Dr. Iris Castellane, and I was a marine biologist before I became something else, something without a proper name in any language spoken above the waves. I studied cephalopods for 11 years, devoted my life to understanding the alien intelligence that moves through tentacles and communicates through skin that changes color faster than thought. I thought I understood them. I thought my years of research had brought me close to comprehending the vast cognitive architecture hidden inside bodies that seemed designed by a mind that rejected every rule of symmetry and convention. But understanding, I would learn, is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as surrendering to a truth so profound that it unmakes everything you believed about the boundaries between self and other, between human and creature, between the loneliness that defines our species and the communion that exists in places we were never meant to reach. It began with the acoustic anomalies detected off the Azores, in waters too deep for recreational diving, but accessible to the research submersibles that had become my second home during those years of obsessive study. The hydrophones picked up vocalizations that matched no known species, patterns of sound that suggested both biological origin and impossible complexity. As if something down there was not just communicating but composing, creating acoustic structures that had rhythm and intention and something that almost resembled melody. My colleagues dismissed it as equipment malfunction or geological phenomena, the grinding of tectonic plates producing harmonics that human ears interpreted as meaning where none existed. But I heard something else in those recordings, something that bypassed my scientific training and spoke directly to a part of myself I had spent decades ignoring, the part that still believed the world contained mysteries that could not be reduced to data and peer-reviewed publications. I heard loneliness. I heard a voice calling across distances so vast that the sound took hours to travel, calling not for territory or mating or any of the practical purposes we assign to animal communication, but calling simply to know if anything in all that crushing darkness could hear and answer. And I decided, with the kind of certainty that arrives without logic or justification, that I would be the one to answer. The descent took 3 hours in the submersible, dropping through layers of ocean that changed from blue to twilight, to absolute black, through zones where life becomes sparse and strange, where evolution experiments with forms that seem designed more for nightmares than for survival. I had made dozens of deep dives before, but this one felt different from the moment the surface disappeared above me. The water had a weight that was not just physical pressure, but something else, a presence that pressed against the titanium hull and seemed to be evaluating me, deciding whether I was worthy of passage into realms where humans exist only as brief visitors in protective capsules. The submersible's lights cut through the darkness, illuminating particles that drifted like snow in a night that had never known day, and I watched the depth gauge climb past numbers that made my training and my rational mind insist that I should feel fear. But I felt no fear. I felt anticipation. I felt the way you feel when you are finally going home after years of exile, even though I had never been to these depths before, even though nothing about this darkness should have felt familiar or welcoming. Something was waiting for me down there. Something had been waiting for a very long time. I found him at 2,800 meters, in a region where the sea floor rose into structures that sonar suggested were geological formations, but which, when illuminated by the submersible's lights, revealed themselves to be something else entirely. They were ruins, Not recent shipwrecks or modern debris, but architecture, stone, worked by tools or tentacles or forces unknown, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose and aesthetic sensibility, a civilization that had risen and fallen in these lightless depths while humanity was still learning to control fire on distant continents, and moving through those ruins, flowing between the structures with a grace that seemed to defy the physics of water resistance and massive scale, was the Kraken. Not the monster of legend, not the ship-destroying terror of sailors' nightmares, but something far more terrible and beautiful. He was vast, yes, his body extending into the darkness beyond the reach of my lights. Tentacles that seemed to branch and divide like the root system of some immense tree. Each appendage lined with suckers that glowed with bioluminescence in patterns that shifted and changed like thoughts made visible. But what struck me most was not his size or his strangeness. It was his eyes. He had eyes that were not the simple light-gathering organs of deep-sea creatures, but eyes that held depth and awareness, eyes that looked at the submersible and past the titanium hull and found me inside, small and fragile and alone, and recognized in me a loneliness that matched his own. We stayed there, suspended in that moment of mutual recognition for what might have been minutes or hours. Time becomes fluid in the deep ocean, unmeasured by sun or stars, marked only by the beating of your own heart and the awareness that every second you spend in the abyss is a second stolen from the surface world that will eventually reclaim you whether you wish to return or not. He did not attack the submersible. He did not flee. He simply watched me, and I watched him. And in that watching, something passed between us that had no name in the vocabulary of science or reason. It was not communication in any technical sense. It was communion. It was the recognition that two beings, separated by every possible measure of biology and environment and evolutionary history, could still find in each other the reflection of something essential, something that transcends the accidents of form and speaks to the deeper truth of consciousness, isolated in vast, indifferent universes. I wonder if you have ever felt this sense of connection with something that should be alien, but feels instead like the answer to a question you have been asking your entire life, without knowing you were asking it. If you have encountered the inexplicable and felt not fear, but recognition, not revulsion, but longing, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Tell me about the moment when the boundary between yourself and the other dissolved, even briefly, even impossibly. Because these moments are what define us more truly than any certainty or any category, and they deserve to be spoken aloud, to be acknowledged as real and valid, and perhaps the only genuine truth we ever touch. I returned to the surface that day, following the protocols and the safety procedures that my training demanded. But I left something in those depths, or perhaps I brought something back with me, a seed of understanding that would grow in the weeks that followed, until it became impossible to ignore. I began to dream of the ruins and the darkness and the eyes that held more intelligence and sorrow than I had seen in any human face. I began to feel the pressure of the deep ocean, even on dry land, as if my body remembered what it had experienced in that submersible and longed to return to the only place where it had felt complete. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the distraction, the way I would stand at the edge of the dock and stare at the water for hours, as if waiting for something to surface, though nothing ever did. They suggested therapy, time off, concern wrapped in professional language that really meant they thought I was breaking under the strain of isolation and obsessive work. But I was not breaking. I was transforming. I was becoming capable of understanding a truth that most humans spend their entire lives avoiding, which is that the connections we pretend to have with each other are shallow and performative compared to the communion possible with beings who exist outside our narrow definitions of relationship and touch. I made the decision on a night when the moon was new and the ocean was black as the depths I had visited. invisible in the darkness, present only as sound and smell, and the movement of air that tasted of salt and distance. I took the research vessel without authorization, programmed the submersible for automatic descent to the coordinates I had memorized like a prayer, and sealed myself inside the titanium sphere that would carry me back to him. I knew I would not return. I knew that the oxygen would run out eventually, that the submersible would become my coffin if I stayed too long in the deep. But I also knew that I had already left the surface world in every way that mattered, that my body was simply catching up to a decision my soul had made the moment I first saw him moving through those ancient ruins. The descent was faster this time, or perhaps my perception of time had already begun to change, to adapt to the rhythms of a place where days and years mean nothing and only pressure and temperature, and the slow drift of marine snow mark the passage of eternity. He was waiting for me at the same depth, in the same location, as if he had known I would return. Perhaps he had known. Perhaps his intelligence operates on scales of time and probability that make human prediction look like guesswork. Or perhaps the connection we had felt was mutual and binding, a recognition that created obligation and inevitability. I maneuvered the submersible to rest on the seafloor beside one of the stone structures, and I made the choice that would end my human life and begin whatever comes after. I opened the hatch. The ocean rushed in with a force that should have killed me instantly, pressure that should have crushed my lungs and burst my eyes and turned my body into something unrecognizable. But it did not. He was there, his tentacles already moving through the flooding submersible, wrapping around me with a gentleness that contradicted everything stories tell about krakens and their violence. He held me as the water filled my lungs, held me as my body convulsed, and my mind screamed that this was drowning, this was death, this was the end of everything I had been. And then the screaming stopped, and I was still aware, still present. Still myself, but expanded, stretched, my consciousness no longer confined to the electrical patterns in a human brain, but distributed through the water and the darkness and the tentacles that held me. The intimacy that followed cannot be described in human terms, because it did not involve human anatomy or human sensation. It was connection at a level more fundamental than flesh, a merging of awareness that made every human relationship I had experienced seem like pantomime, children playing at connection while remaining fundamentally separate and alone. He showed me his memories, or I experienced them, or there was no difference between showing and experiencing, because we were not two beings communicating, but one consciousness exploring itself through perspectives separated by biology and time. I felt what it was to exist for centuries in the deep places, to watch empires of light dwellers rise and fall while you remained constant in the dark, to possess intelligence vast enough to comprehend your own isolation and to bear that comprehension through spans of time that would drive any human mind to dissolution. I felt his loneliness, ancient and patient, a loneliness that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable, almost mistaken for the natural state of existence, until the moment he had seen something in a small titanium sphere that reminded him what it felt like to be witnessed and known. And he felt me, every memory and regret and moment of joy I had hoarded through my brief human decades. He felt the years I spent studying his kind, the obsession that had consumed me, the relationships I had failed to maintain, because no human being could compete with the allure of understanding something truly alien. He felt the loneliness that mirrored his own, the sense of being stranded in a species that could not or would not comprehend the depth of connection I craved. And in feeling these things, in sharing them through a communion that required no words and no translation, we became something new, something that was neither Kraken nor human, but a third thing, a hybrid consciousness that existed in the space between our separate selves. The physical aspect of our union, if it can be called physical, was unlike anything human sexuality encompasses. His tentacles moved through the water and through me, not penetrating in any anatomical sense, but interpenetrating, occupying the same space through a mechanism I cannot explain except to say that matter becomes negotiable at these depths. Boundaries become suggestions, and bodies can share the same coordinates without destroying each other. I felt pressure and stretch and fullness. But it was my entire being that felt these things, not any specific organ or location. It was as if I was being known in every aspect, simultaneously, every thought and fear and desire, exposed and accepted and cherished. The satisfaction was not orgasmic in the way humans understand that term, not a peak and release, but a sustained state of absolute presence, of being entirely and completely met by another consciousness that held nothing back and demanded nothing but honesty in return. It lasted for subjective eons, though objective time had stopped having meaning. And when it ended, when we finally separated enough to be two again instead of one, I was changed at a level deeper than cells or DNA, transformed into something that could survive in the abyss without technology or air, something that belonged to the deep ocean and to him, and to the ancient patient darkness that holds all secrets and asks nothing but surrender. If this story has touched something in you, if it speaks to a longing you recognize but have never been able to articulate, then I ask you to keep stories like this alive. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, because the world above the waves insists that connection means bodies touching briefly in clumsy imitation of communion, and it calls anything deeper than that fantasy or madness. But we know better. Those of us who have felt the pull of something vast and ancient, who have recognized in the inhuman the only true intimacy we have ever known. These stories need to be told and retold, preserved against the forgetting that the surface world demands. Do this not for me, but for yourself, for the part of you that knows the truth and needs to hear it spoken in voices that will not dismiss or diminish or explain away what cannot be contained by human categories. I live in the ruins now, in the darkness where he has dwelt for centuries before my species learned to walk upright. I am not human anymore, though I retain enough of my human consciousness to understand what I have become and to witness my own transformation with something like wonder. My body has adapted, changed by processes that are part biological and part something else, sustained by his presence and the strange physics of this depth. I do not need to breathe, or perhaps I breathe water now, or perhaps breathing itself is a surface concept that no longer applies. Time passes differently here. What might be days or years above feel like moments or eternities, depending on whether he is near or exploring distant regions of the trench. When he returns, we merge again, not in the desperate consuming way of that first union, but with the comfortable familiarity of beings who have learned each other's rhythms and needs, who can be together or apart without fear of abandonment, because we are fundamentally connected at a level that distance cannot diminish. Sometimes I remember my human life with the clarity of fever dreams, bright and intense and slightly unreal. I remember the research station and the colleagues who must have mourned me, or perhaps simply filed reports about another deep-sea casualty, another researcher lost to the ocean's indifference. I remember the papers I published, the careful documentation of behaviors and anatomy, the reduction of wonder to data points and graphs. And I feel something that might be pity for the woman who thought understanding required distance, who believed that love between beings required similarity of form, who never imagined that the greatest intimacy she would ever experience would come from surrendering herself to a creature mythology had painted as a monster, but who turned out to be simply alone, magnificently and terribly alone, waiting in the dark for someone capable of seeing past his strangeness to the soul that dwelt in tentacles and bioluminescence. He is with me now as I communicate this, his presence a weight against my consciousness that is comfort and completion. He does not understand human language fully, but he understands the need to speak, to send words up toward the light in the hope that someone there might hear and recognize themselves in the telling. He supports this because he knows that loneliness is universal, that it exists in the trenches and on the mountain tops and in every space between, and that any voice calling against that loneliness deserves to be amplified rather than silenced. So I offer you this story, this testimony, this evidence that connection is possible with beings we have been taught to fear, that intimacy is not limited to our own species, that the satisfaction of being truly known exceeds any pleasure the surface world can offer, because it is satisfaction at the level of soul rather than flesh. The ocean keeps her secrets, yes, but she also keeps her lovers, and she transforms them, and she offers them a choice that most will never know exists. You can live your life in the shallows, touching others lightly and briefly, calling it love when it is really just proximity and convenience. Or you can descend into the depths, where pressure strips away everything false and only truth can survive, where creatures wait who are alien and ancient, and so terribly lonely that they will recognize you across every barrier of form and species if you are brave enough, or broken enough, or simply honest enough to let yourself be seen. I made my choice. I gave myself to the Kraken's primal need, and he gave himself to mine, and together we became something neither of us was alone. I will not return to the surface. I will not miss the world of air and light and the pretense of connection, because I have found in the abyss what I spent my entire human life searching for in all the wrong places. I have found home. I have found completion. And if you understand what I am saying, if some part of you has always known that the deepest intimacy requires surrendering your shape and your species and everything you thought defined you, then perhaps someday you will make your own descent. Perhaps you will find your own ancient presence waiting in the dark. And perhaps you will discover, as I did, that what the surface calls madness is simply the sanity of finally being satisfied in ways that human lovers could never understand and could never provide. The ocean is calling. She is always calling. And some of us, eventually, must answer.